Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about Cassandra's Dream Song, and this is the first video in a series where I'm going to go through some standard contemporary repertoire and break them down, give you some background, and make them a little bit less intimidating for you to start. And we started with one of the most intimidating. Cassandra is an incredibly difficult piece to start working on, and I've spent a lot of time with it, and I want to kind of share some stuff with you that has helped me become friends with it. Brian Ferneyhough is the composer who wrote Cassandra's Dream Song. He was born in 1943 in England, and he moved to the States in 1987 and still lives there. He teaches at Stanford currently. He's best known for being one of the major figures in the New Complexity movement. New Complexity is a compositional style that was biggest in the 1980s. It involves incredibly complex textures and rhythms and really pushed the boundaries of what musical writing could do with nested tuplets, microtones, and very extended music. It was also a bit of a reaction to serialists of the post-World War II era, and while the music was incredibly complex and dense and mechanical seeming, it used poetic titles and cycles and more creative and less cerebral ideas. So, Cassandra was written in 1970 through 1971, so a little bit before New Complexity was really at its height. It's Ferneyhough's first work for solo flute, and while he's written some really important works for solo flute later, this is the one that's really stood the test of time. Flutists still play it, and it's still really in the center of standard contemporary work. It's on competition lists, and it's one of these pieces that people do perform even if they're not a contemporary specialist. The piece is based on the myth of Cassandra and Apollo. Cassandra was this beautiful woman, and Apollo fell in love with her. He pursued her, as Greek gods are like to do, and she was not interested. And eventually he bargains with her that he'll give her whatever she wants, basically, in exchange for her marrying him. So she asks for the gift of foresight, which means that she can see into the future. He agrees and gives her this gift, and she turns around and has tricked him into giving her this gift. She refuses to marry him still, and that sends Apollo into a rage. He, out of anger, curses Cassandra to never be believed. So while she maintains this gift of foresight and knows what's going to happen in the future, no one will ever believe her. And that's where you get this piece. It's written on 2 sheets of paper. There's sheet 1 and sheet 2, and the left-hand side is Cassandra's voice, and the right-hand side is Apollo's voice. And this piece is almost looking into an argument. While they might not necessarily be talking to each other, they're both incredibly frustrated and angry and express that in different ways based on their personalities and what's just happened to them. The left page, which is the Cassandra page, is a fantasy on A4. It starts and ends with that note, and even though each line develops past that A, it always returns. And for me, that's a symbol of her struggle to never be believed. She knows all these things, and she wants to express them, and she can't. And it's incredibly frustrating. She's also angry that she's been cursed. So while her anger is more controlled than Apollo's, which we'll talk about in a second, she's still frustrated and trying to break away from this A, which is the center of her curse, basically. The Apollo page, on the other hand, is incredibly erratic and incredibly angry. It really feels like someone is incredibly angry and expressing that as much as they can. And while there's calm points and his anger is kind of reeled back, it always bursts forward, and there's a lot of very intense playing. So, how do these 2 voices interact? And that's one of the really cool things about this piece, is because of the way Ferneyhough set it up, it can change depending on how you want to interpret it that day. The first page has to be played in order, but between each line of Cassandra's page, you put an Apollo line. Cassandra's lines are numbered, and you play them 1 through 6. Apollo's lines are lettered A through E, and you can play them in any order. So you can go 1B, 2E, whatever it is, or you can play them in order. It really doesn't matter. And that's part of the expressive and the interpretive quality of the piece, is you have to find the order that you want to play them. And whether that's the same way every time or different based on the performance venue or how you're feeling that day is up to the performer. Personally, I've always played it the same way, but currently thinking about it and reworking it, I'm actually starting to adjust the order I play the Apollo lines in, because I think I've grown with it a little bit more and I want to express his voice in a different way. Apart from that, and the fact that it has to be about 10 minutes long, Ferneyhough doesn't really give you a lot of limitations in what you have to do. And one of the things he even says is that the point of the piece is the attempt. And one of the things he even admits is that a lot of this isn't possible. But what he wants is a piece where the interpretation and the difficulty of playing is part of the musical content. And there's a huge philosophical debate that can be brought up of what denotes an effective performance of this piece because of that. Is it just that attempting it is an effective performance, or do you have to get 90% of the way there? Like, there's a very, very interesting thing to think about of what makes an effective performance of a piece that isn't meant to be played properly. And there's some performers that refuse to play Ferneyhough's music that's written like this because they don't want to play a piece where the point isn't to play it right. But for me, I think that frustration and that struggle that I have playing it is incredibly musical because of the texture of the piece. Piece is impossible to explain in full. I can't go through and tell you how to do everything. I'm gonna kind of go through the lines and break down what's happening to an extent and give you some ideas of how to work on it. The reality of this piece is that it requires you to spend time with it. It took me a year to learn, and I'm still learning it, quite honestly. There's still things that I'm adjusting and I'm changing and I'm learning to do better, and that's part of the magic of the piece, is it changes with you as you grow and get better. And this isn't a piece that I ever recommend to a beginning contemporary performer. It requires you to be incredibly comfortable with the contemporary techniques that are involved because you're stacking them. So if you can play everything that's on the page by itself, then you can start learning to play them together. If you're still learning the techniques, this isn't a piece that I would recommend you start with, just because it's going to be even more frustrating than it would be if you had the control over the techniques that you're being asked to do. We're gonna go through Cassandra's page first, and then I'll do Apollo's page. The first line is really where the A is ever present. While there are a few notes that aren't A, it's really just stable on the A the entire time and expresses Cassandra's initial frustration. For me, this is the easiest line because it doesn't stack the techniques as much as it does later in the piece, and you're mostly just playing one note. The thing that you do have to keep in mind is the dynamics are incredibly important, and some of them are hard to do just because he's asking for very, very quick dynamic changes and very, very exaggerated dynamic changes. The second and third lines really do stack a lot of techniques. You have playing with key clicks on top of it with vibrato changes, and that can be kind of scary. My suggestion with those is break each gesture down. So if you can see in line 2, you start off with just a few notes. So start with that, and then work on the next one, and then work on the next one, and then eventually, as you get more comfortable with each separate section, you can start trying to link them. Also, something that's incredibly important is that the different fermatas do have to sound different. He uses 3 different shapes of fermatas to indicate different lengths of time, and he means them. So a short fermata shouldn't sound the same as a long fermata, and that seems logical, but sometimes you hear people just play fermatas because they can. Also, something to keep in mind is that in the third line, the sung portion is incredibly difficult to keep a straight face because the first time you do it, it sounds ridiculous. but it is a serious gesture. The fourth line has these tongue-stopped key clicks. They function the same way as a tongue ram, where they sound a seventh lower than the flute, but instead of your air creating that sound, it's just a percussive key click. Those take a little bit of getting used to because you're not expecting that sound to come out of the flute, and if the flute isn't stopped correctly, you're gonna get the higher octave. So that just takes a little bit of time. If you're comfortable with tongue rams, you'll get used to this pretty quickly. But definitely take the time to really make sure that you're playing the correct notes and you're clicking the right fingers. He indicates which fingers should be used for the key clicks, and that really makes a difference. There's a few that don't work super well for the dynamic, and with those, as long as you're getting the right sound, I would say use the fingers that work. But for most of them, he really did take the time to figure out which fingerings were gonna be the most effective. 5 is probably the most difficult line on the page because it has about 40,000 notes. That's just technical practice. It took me a long time and a lot of drilling to get the grace notes especially right, but with time they do come. I will say that the slap tongue section in the second line isn't possible. If you can do it, please tell me how. I had to kind of create a percussive sound that emulated slap tongue because I can't play them that fast. And that was an incredibly frustrating thing to realize because honestly my slap tongue is one of the things I'm most proud of, and to find a slap tongue passage that I just couldn't do was really discouraging. The last line I think is really beautiful and lyrical, and I personally play it like that, though you do have to keep in mind that he dictates the vibrato through the entire piece, and so you can't use vibrato to make things lyrical when the vibrato isn't indicated. It has a melody and it has more traditional lyrical qualities, and it's really a great way to end the piece because after playing all of these notes and all of this very complicated technical music, you get a chance to show a different side of your playing. One of the things that people don't realize with music like this is that it can be incredibly lyrical and it can be incredibly beautiful. It just has non-traditional sounds in it. Then you get the Apollo page. And the Apollo page is much more difficult, for me at least, because it doesn't really follow the same theme that the Cassandra page does. With Cassandra, you know that you're always returning to that A, there's a sense of frustration. With Apollo, he's angry and he's yelling and he's out of control. And the music expresses that, which means that the music is more out of control. The first line is incredibly loud and difficult and has things that are just incredibly difficult to do. And that just takes time. Honestly, the key to this piece is time and giving it the time it needs to settle in your fingers and to feel comfortable with being uncomfortable. The B line is the thing I still can't play. It really just throws me for a loop, and I have to be very careful where I place it in the piece because if I play it after certain Cassandra lines, I just crash and burn every time, and not in a good, this is only slightly out of control, this is completely out of control and I'm not happy with it kind of way. It's incredibly rhythmic and the articulation is very, very important. And it goes the entire range of the flute with every technique you can possibly think of stacked on top of each other. I had to break it down into tiny little sections to even get a chance to learn it. Section C is actually really interesting because you have a choice within the choice of the line. You can play the gestures in any order, keeping in mind that the fermatas do connect to the lines. And you can also play it with any dynamic, ranging between very, very soft and very, very loud. Personally, I chose to kind of let the line dictate what dynamic it would be based on the difficulty of playing it. With this one, I chose comfort over out of control just because I needed a section that I could really grab onto and calm myself down because of everything else that was happening. Line D is incredibly lyrical again. There's a lot of vibrato modulation and quarter tones and just use of timbral ideas. I kind of see this line as Apollo calming himself down for a second and then working himself back up. The one thing to keep in mind is the ending of this line is incredibly difficult. It requires you to have control of both your voice and the flute and be able to control them separately. What I would suggest to work on this is do long tones on the same pitch and work on crescendoing just the flute or just your voice. And as you get control of that, start working on crescendoing the flute while decrescendoing in your voice and the opposite, so that when you have to change notes in this while moving the voice and flute in the opposite directions dynamically, you have the comfort level to be able to do that. The last line doesn't really have anything particularly different in it. It really does follow the same themes of the Apollo line of extreme dynamic ranges, extreme range, and a lot of techniques stacked on top of each other. One thing to keep in mind is that when he says that the last note should be 12 seconds long, it needs to be 12 seconds long, and a pitch bend that is 12 seconds long is very difficult to execute because everything in this piece is difficult to execute. I start the pitch bend later in the note and will sometimes go lower than the full half step just to extend the pitch bend for the length of time. So yeah, that's kind of my breakdown of Cassandra. I hope this was helpful. Please let me know what piece you want me to talk about next and whether you guys want me to talk more about the background of the pieces or the actual technical execution of the pieces. If you guys like this video, please give it a like. If you're new here, subscribe. If you want to support me more, check out my Patreon, and I will see you guys on Thursday.